All right, so I'll start off. For our project description, we have a man, John Smith, who's 31 years old with good credit, that works in San Antonio. He worked hard and he received a hefty cash bonus and a raise. And to celebrate this, he's decided to buy a new car with cash. He's always wanted to buy an electric car, but is unsure if the higher cost is worth the investment in the long run. So before he makes this choice, we will be comparing the benefits of similar gas, hybrid, and EV models over the next 5 years. The three models we'll be looking at is for gas, the BMW 530, for hybrid, the Volvo S90 hybrid plug-in, and for the electric, the Audi e-tron Sportback. Some additional information to note is he is a homeowner and he will be using this car for working commute. And we'll now go over to our assumptions. So we've broken this down for each section by the three different cars. For purchase price, we're not including sales tax. And for the hybrid and EV, the charger will be included. These costs were based off the company site. And we decided to do about a 5,000 to 10,000 price difference to try to see if that EV car, if you pay that additional money, is it still worth it? For insurance, we did it based on an annual price. All of them will be from Geico. So we got a per month quote and multiplied that by 12. For the maintenance, this is also off of an annual price. And while we weren't able to get all the same sources, we were able to still get an average. So for the gas and hybrid, we were able to base it off of a 10-year average. And for the EV, we based it off of a 5-year average. For the MPG and range, for the gas, we have a base, best, and worst case. For that base case, we have it for 29, and we did for the best and worst case, we did 20% more or less. And for the hybrid and gas, that MPG range will be factored into our calculations. All of these were gotten off of from Edmunds and then also the company sites themselves. For the batteries, for the hybrid and EV, we were also able to get it off of the company website, and it will be used in the cost per mile calculations. For the miles driven, the way we were able to determine these numbers was we found the average amount someone drives in an urban setting, and then we did 15% more and then 15% less. For the input prices, we got all of that from the Federal Reserve St. Louis over the last 22 years. For the base case, we got the average, and for the gas prices, and then we got the highest and lowest. And then for the electricity prices, we got the average and then the lowest and highest. For the tax credit, the gas car will not have any sort of tax credit, but the hybrid and the electric, we were able to get an exact price for those specific cars. So that will be how much you get tax credit on. For the inflation rate, we got 4.7%. We also got that from the Federal Reserve St. Louis based on the last 10 years, though we did not use 2020, so up to 2019. For the EV and hybrid cost per mile, we were able to use a cost calculator. And it's important to note for the hybrid, we are using the assumption that the battery will be used 50% of the time. So that's what we'll use for our calculations. And then lastly, for the weighted cost of capital, we decided on 5%.
We're not going to touch on the summary table quite yet. We did put it in the front because we felt that was the best place for it. We'll come back to it once we go over the rest of our analysis, and then we'll cover that some more. But this is going to be our EV versus gas. All of our numbers, we tried to relate it back to what the EVs cost were. So all of our NPV numbers are going to be based off in relation to what the EV was, because the overarching goal of this is to prove if the more expensive electric vehicle is worth the price difference, if you can make that up or close it enough where it makes sense. For our gas savings, we use the mile per gallon that we have in the assumptions page, and we calculate that in for each of our cases. The maintenance savings is also in relation to how much the EV cost. And so we also relate that back along with the insurance and total saved. This line right here, right after year 5, I believe it's year 5. Yes, is going to be the cutoff for what we decided was a realistic time frame for having a car like that. Our numbers do go past that to 15 because that's pretty much as far as you're going to get with a vehicle. We figured that would be the upper limit, and we just use that as a way to further illustrate how long it would take you to pay it back if you did keep it for that long. Over here, we have our initial costs. We have this calculation, that way it's easy to understand. We have the tax credit in here because that was a big factor when we were looking at the cars, was how much was the tax credit and how far up the price chain we could get without it being so ridiculous that there was just no way that we could cover it with the gas car. Then our gas savings calculation would be miles driven divided by miles per gallon times the price per gallon. These are the best ways that we decided that we would calculate those things. Do y'all see this if I move the Zoom by any chance? Or does it just show my Excel?
It's just showing your Excel.
Okay, I just want to make sure that me moving the Zoom.
Oh, that you're talking about the cursor? Yeah, I can see the cursor. Yeah.
Okay. And then for the previous year saving, we just did the previous year savings times 1 plus the gas inflation, since we figured it was important to increase with inflation. And then these are the numbers that we ended up getting for the base case for the electronic vehicle versus the gas. Net present value was a negative 2,782. So we rejected that. And then our internal rate of return was a negative 12.5%, with our discounted payback being 8.72, which we did not think was worth. Further on, this is going to be our best case. And our best case means highest gas price, lowest electric price, and most miles driven. We decided that with the numbers that we had, that the more you drive and you use that electric vehicle, the better, because if you don't drive, then there's not a lot of room for you to use those gas numbers that we were hoping would go up. So you can see a pretty big difference in the discounted payback and the NPV for this and the base case. The internal rate of return was 30.09%. We accepted that. The net present value was 4,438. Our percent of years used, or the discounted payback, ended up being about half, a little less than half of what the base case was. And again, the gas savings is in relation to how much you would be spending on gas. So in this case, it would be a lot of money on gas and not a lot on electric, because all of this is used as a comparison to what the EV numbers are. And we wanted to illustrate that as well as possible. And then we will go into the worst case here. And in this case, we actually added the additional electricity costs because we had it as you actually start losing money using the EV in our worst case. So we decided that that was an important part to add. So you can see here that there's not any gas savings. And then once we go into here, it's going to be the total saved with these two calculations. So the EV is going to be a little bit more expensive to maintain. It's going to be a little bit less on the insurance side, but this will be the total saved. And then with the energy cost, this is going to be where we factor in the energy that we had with the loss of the high gas price advantage that we were hoping for. And then again, our net present value is actually going to be extremely negative, and the internal rate of return is going to be a pretty extreme negative 43.52%. So we rejected both of those numbers. And the discounted payback is actually going to go well past our 15-year mark. And that's a pretty good representation of how bad this case would be for the EV. So I think that is it. Are you ready for the gas versus hybrid?
Yep.
Okay, so moving on to the costs and benefits of the hybrid over the gas car. And in this case, that's the Volvo S90 and the BMW 530. And then as we can see in the base case, the initial cost is around $9,480. And as you can see on the side in the explanation of calculation, that includes that 5,420 tax credit. So looking at our base case, you can see that there are a lot of gas, maintenance, and insurance savings, but not as much as we just saw with the EV versus gas. And the calculations are very similar to how Braden just explained them. And instead of using like the EV costs, we substituted in for the hybrid costs and savings instead. And as we saw before, the total savings are going to be factoring in the gas inflation. So scrolling down to the MPV. So looking at the table and the MPV for the first 5 years, we do see that it's negative and that we had to reject it. But when we do look at the table for the 5 years, especially the cumulative MPV, it is decreasing. If you could scroll up a little bit. Oh, thank you. We can see that the owner is mitigating that initial 9,000 cost difference. But we can see with the negative internal rate of return and the discounted payback that it's, scroll down a little bit, that it is more than 15 years. And then we can see that the benefits are not as substantial enough to really return that extra investment of buying a hybrid sooner than later, especially considering the life of the car is, usually within a decade. But when we look at our best case, things are looking a lot more positive, a lot more greater benefits. And we could really see these benefits, especially in the gas savings, which I want to say is about like 1,000 more than we just saw in our base case. And here the MPV, if you scroll down a little bit, is still negative, and we had to reject it, but it's much more closer to zero than the base case. And the internal rate of return is also negative, but it's much higher than the base case. And seeing as the discounted payback is 8.6 years, we, if we did maybe do a rate for those 9 years instead of 5 years, I would say the rate would definitely be positive and that we would accept it in that case. And it would be maybe around, I want to say maybe 5 or 6% possibly. And we can see that in this ideal situation with increased driving and increased driving and the purchase of the hybrid over the electric car is much more worth it and has more benefits and returns that you get much sooner than we just saw in the base case. And lastly, the worst case. In this case, we're driving less, the gas is low and the electricity is high, and we can see that there's no gas savings, and instead we have the additional energy costs that Braden also explained. And in this situation, unfortunately, our net cash flows are increasingly getting more negative. So this situation, if you scroll down, will never have a positive NPV, and the hybrid owner will probably not ever close that initial cost difference gap. So in the worst case, the extra investment is not worth it for the hybrid owner.
All right, to look at the EV versus hybrid, like Braden said, everything would go back to how the EV compares to the hybrid. As we can see, the maintenance savings isn't significantly high, and neither is the insurance savings. Compared to like how Braden discussed, the EV versus gas insurance savings weren't that high either, but however, with the hybrid, it is a little lower. To explain the base case, can you go up a little? Can you scroll up a little? Like to the base case. Thank you. And then to explain the base case, we can see that the total save starts with 737. This initial cost that we have right here comes from the purchase of the hybrid to the tax credit. It would be different here compared to the other one because both of the cars will have a tax credit. The EV will have a slightly higher tax credit than the hybrid will. Therefore, the initial cost will have a difference. If we scroll down a little, we can see that the net present value would be 2,687. Well, we would still reject this price, and the internal rate of return would be 16%. And the internal rate of return would be this because of the cash flow being slightly less than the internal rate of return being slightly less than the cash flow. To go down, we can see the best case where the miles are higher, like driven, because at 14,000, the gas savings would be, therefore it would be higher because the EV doesn't require any gas towards where the hybrid does. And we can see that the net present value would be, can you scroll down a little, 3,615, and we would still reject this. And the internal rate of return would be 12%, and the discounted payback would be 8.82. And to go to the worst case, like Braden said, that the energy costs would play a factor into this, and we can see that it will be significantly getting negative and more negative over time, and this plays a factor into the net cash flow. And the net present value in this would be 5,735 with the internal rate of return of 37%. And the discounted payback would be a little bit by a decade, therefore it would be 15.
Okay, so now for our break-even analysis, we thought the most logical thing to test would be the miles driven to see how many miles it would take for the NPV to be zero, and to really see how or when buying one car over the other would really be worth it. So as we can see, the EV versus gas, if you go all the way up, thank you. Positive returns or the benefits will only be achieved when the miles reach about 32,227 per day, and the calculation on the bottom shows about 88 miles per day. And then scrolling down for the gas versus hybrid, thank you. It's going to be about 162,591, about 445 miles per day. It's a very high number, but it's most likely because the benefits are much narrower than the other comparisons. And lastly, for the hybrid versus EV, we could see that it's about 43,063 miles, or about 117 miles per day to reach a zero net present value. So overall, with the break even that we can see that with EV owners, they can justify that extra investment over a gas car much sooner than the other models.
To go on the intangibles, we will first start with the emissions. The emissions plays a factor here because car emissions are a major source of pollution, and cars emit almost 20% of all greenhouse gases. As we can see, the average for gas would be 11,000, and the hybrid would only have an average of 6,000, with the electric having an average of around like 4,000. The infrastructure would be different because San Antonio in general has it's a 3-to-1 ratio compared to the gas stations, compared to the charging stations. There are 650 gas stations, while the EV charging stations would only be 232. This EV does have a slight disadvantage if you're not a non-home residency, because they don't have, like, if you're at a house, you can have your own charger at your house. However, if you're in an apartment or even some student livings, they do not have charging stations for your car. Therefore, you would have to go to a charging station. The initial cost also is intangible, because EVs and hybrids both get a tax credit, and the tax credit is given by the government because, like, basically rewarding people for using non-gas cars. And therefore you get around 7,500 for EV, and the hybrids aren't that high, but it is significantly, like, somewhere below an average of that. The range really plays a factor as well, because for electric cars, if you have longer road trips and if you have more miles in your road trip, it wouldn't be the most practical, because you have to plan your trip out in ahead and make sure that you can find a charging station in between or even at the place when you reach your destination. However, for hybrids, it would be much more practical, because if you aren't driving that many miles, you can have the option of both using electric and driving with gas. The charging time also plays a factor, because the Audi e-tron charges the car in 30 minutes, where if you compare it to a gas car, that would be an average of 8 minutes to go with it. The major maintenance and repair would basically be that the EV has about two batteries. One battery would be just to function the inside of the car, and they have a main battery underneath it, which powers the second battery and basically the whole car. Therefore, if this battery goes out, which it will sooner, as I would say about like 10 years, and that cost would be very significant. In our case, buying a car with a loan and lease doesn't play a factor. However, if you are trying to look at it with a tax credit, it does, because if you lease a car with a tax credit, you don't get the tax credit. The manufacturer that you lease the car out from will get the tax credit, and they are not. And sometimes, in most cases, they will decrease that from your monthly payment. However, it's not a mandatory thing that they have to do. The model options are also for EV and hybrid. There are not as many as gas cars. However, like in the future, this has been changing. Just starting this year, we have 63 new models of electric cars coming. So therefore, in the next 5 years, we will have a significant amount of more EV cars. Gas prices, as we know right now, they are kind of high. However, the average price to fall is 93 in 2003. The electricity generation of new energy sources will rise about 1% from the next 3 years. There's never a clear thing where we can see if the gas prices will go down or up. Like, just for talking about right now, we can see that the gas prices went up significantly. And the last intangible would be the backup. The hybrid has an advantage right here because they have gas price. It uses gas and electric. And in the EV, you cannot get that. And the gas obviously is only a gas car.
Okay, so lastly, we're just going to be looking at the summary table, or before our final recommendations, we'll look at the summary table. And as we've kind of reiterated throughout our presentation, the biggest focus we had were the miles driven, gas prices, and electricity prices, because these are going to vary depending on each case. It's important to note that with the net present value, the only positive is with the EV versus gas best case. Also, with the break even, you see a much higher amount of miles that need to be driven with the gas versus hybrid. So we will now be going to our final recommendations.
So to kind of wrap everything up, our initial analysis began with us seeing if we could get a much nicer electric vehicle and see if all of the intangibles that get wrapped up that we've discussed so far in this analysis helped mitigate the larger prices and maybe the least accessible charging stations and things like that But from what we've seen, pretty much the only time that it becomes viable for you to pay a significant amount more for an electric vehicle is if you plan on driving a lot. And I mean a lot. We've had the numbers posted previously, and it was a pretty significant difference. The gas cars definitely have a lot more availability and a lot more accessibility when it comes to doing things, but we actually ended up coming to a conclusion that we hadn't originally thought of, where the hybrid, if you're driving a lot of very short distances, the hybrid pulls out pretty far in terms of how the cost effective it is. But you also have the availability of going on those long road trips, which is one of the main drawbacks of the EV. That's one of the things we talked about, was the EV requires a lot more micromanaging for trips and more preparation is needed. And charging stations are slightly mitigated by the availability of portable batteries, but those portable batteries typically range from anywhere from $600 to $2-3 grand. We found some that were from the manufacturer for about $1,800 for those extreme cases where you do run out of charge between charging stations or on those long trips. But the gas and hybrid both have the ease availability of gas stations all over the city. And as Colonel said previously, it's a 3-to-1 ratio in San Antonio. And off the top of my head, I can only think of 2. So even then, the visibility of those charging stations is pretty minimal. So in conclusion, you cannot expect to make back what you spend on a nicer EV, but if you drive a lot of city miles, it helps make it more worth it. The hybrid is better for short city trips, but have the benefit of a gas tank for long trips, and the gas car is typically cheaper upfront.
All right. Yeah, very interesting. I like that you have it set up for all these different combinations. Let's get one big confusion you're going to have to help me on this. So get back to the assumptions page. I thought I had it, and then as you went through the scenarios, I got really confused. So go up. It's all about the cost of the car. That's where I'm not following. So the hybrid is cheaper than the EV. So I'm not understanding. So let's do the so the gas versus the hybrid. That's $6,000 difference. Plus there's a tax credit. So go to the gas versus the hybrid base case. Up to the base case. I'm just not understanding. Yeah, go up to the base. That 9480. I'm not understanding that number. How's that number calculated? So go to the actual formula, F9, because I'm not understanding it. B6 minus B8. So are y'all sure y'all have that as gas versus hybrid and not gas versus EVs? So go to 6 versus 8. It seems like it should be 6 versus 7, right? Do I have that wrong? Am I seeing that wrong or not? And then plus, go to the plus 33, just to make sure, plus 33, B33, that should be, okay, that one works. All right, that makes a big difference, doesn't it? Because it seemed like it was, I'll go back to your gas versus, not that I'm trying to justify my purchase, but that makes a pretty huge difference, doesn't it? Am I missing it, or do y'all just have a line off there?
Yeah, I think it's just a line off.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
it was
it's
just
not.
a line off.
It's okay, so it's, you might want to. I mean, if you fix it before you send it to me, I'll take it in consideration. What I would do with this spreadsheet, because you're doing something really interesting here. You probably don't have time for this project, but what would be really valuable to people is that they can plug in whatever car they want to plug in, and you tell them exactly what they need to input. You wouldn't do gas prices, electric prices, those you would, you'd have that in the background, you would input that. But miles that they drive, which car, You could probably even set up a Python program or something. You bring the power prices in, but they could probably do that themselves. The tax credit, if there's some way you could set this up that they plug, because I really think that's the big issue here is how much more. Because when I saw that 9,000, I was like, man, my hybrid wasn't that much more expensive. The other thing was your 50%. So it seems to me if the mileage is low, that you're probably pretty close to 100%. But if your mileage is high, like you said, 14,000 miles. So if you do that, that's a lot more than 35 miles a day, and the hybrid just can't do that. So it would seem like you'd almost have to ask the question, how many days, what percentage of days do you drive fewer than 30 miles? Like for me, it's almost 100%. The only time I drive more than 30 miles is if I go out of town. So I would guess with the hybrid, if I'm close to 100%, I might be able to get this the positive MPV for me. But if
in my case, kind of what we thought of was, in my case, I drive 26 miles to work and 26 miles back from work. So that would be basically using the full charge there and then gas on the way back.
Yeah, so it really depends on the person, but then you'd be driving a lot more miles per year than I would.
Yeah.
Because, I do 30 miles a day, so it's almost perfect for me. I get home and I usually have about 12 miles still left on the. So that's what I'm saying. That, this is real dependent, and I think you got it right. That it's miles driven. I just think that 50% is something you want to do a variable. So what I'm suggesting is you got a really good spreadsheet set up here. You got to double check, every spreadsheet is going to have errors in it. You got to double check your inputs. So I do think the cost is misstated, but if you fix that cost number, what's powerful and really helps you in interviews as well is you have a spreadsheet where anybody can step in, they plug in their particular situation, what car they're buying, what miles they drive, and your spreadsheet immediately gives them an answer. I mean, really, really powerful, right? So double check, just make sure, same thing with the hybrid with the EV. If you go to that one, it just seemed like that one I wasn't understanding at all. So that one I'm a little bit confused on. That 7,400, I don't understand. Yeah, it shouldn't be 6 versus 8. It should be, because the hybrid is cheaper, right? So that one, you might have to redo that one, because I really think that one's not the hybrid versus the EV. I almost think it's the EV versus, how do you have it set up? So you got, go back to that cell. You got 7 minus 8. Yeah, I think you got some issues on that. I think the hybrid versus EV has some issues because you got 7 minus 8, which is actually a benefit, right? Because so here you're saying on the EV versus hybrid versus EV, are you asking if the EV is worth the extra expense? Right, so it's really the EV versus the hybrid. So here you're asking, should he spend the extra $8,000 for the hybrid? I mean, for the EV?
Yes.
So there, I don't think the 550 is right either, because I think you got to get the tax credits in there. So 7 minus 8, but I actually think it's 7 minus 8, and then the 33 versus 34. I think you got to put that in there too. So what is the tax credit? The tax credits is not a big difference, is it? Oh, it is. Okay, so that would be material. Actually, yeah, so you'll have to, right, so if you fix your spreadsheet, because I'm actually really interested in, you got really good analysis here, but I just think there's some issues there with some of the numbers. Yeah, I think the issue is you just got so many moving parts, and I think you copied without going back and looking. That another team had that same issue with their case. So yeah, you want B7 minus A33. So you can lock that in if you want to, but it should be minus that. So B7 minus that, and then the other one should be minus B8 minus B34. And I don't know why you're getting a value. Assumptions B7. Oh, because it's A33 instead of B33 on that first one. Should be B. All right, that makes more sense. All right, I think that's right, right? The EV is about $6,000 more expensive. Does that sound right after you take in the tax credit? Because it's about $8,000 more expensive, but the tax credit's about $2,000, so that looks about right.
So these
Right,
are
so if
pretty
y'all
close
fix
to the
that. I
numbers we
think
had.
everything else is correct, and I think it's interesting in your worst case that the gas is actually cheaper than electricity. I mean, that's what you're saying, right? In your
Yes.
worst case, it's actually, and that's because you got $1 of gas, but you got electricity. I think it's unlikely gas would be $1 if electricity is really expensive. I think that's scenario. So that's a kind of a really, really worst case scenario. That's unlikely, but that's what you do in the worst case, right? You're saying for some reason electricity got really expensive, even though gas is really cheap. Hard to think of a world where that would be the case. Okay, so look at your summary table and see how much it impacted it. See how radical it is.
We'd have to go back and change all of them for it to get a.
Yeah. So adjust that. I really want to see your final case, and I'll count off a little bit because it's some errors, but I think almost every team has some errors. Yours just happen to be pretty material because it's on the upfront cost. But if you adjust that, I'm really curious what you came up with. I really like one thing your team, the other team did, that other teams didn't do, is you had a really good basis for your best and worst case. I really like that. And your intangibles was excellent. So you did a really good job on that. And then I like the fact that Braden actually did a final recommendation. I've had struggle with the last 3 teams where they finished and they didn't tell me what the recommendation was. So y'all did well on everything except for you just got some typos in your spreadsheet that you got to fix, which is pretty common in Excel. You should always be a little nervous when you're doing Excel and going back and double checking. I like to have someone else just go in. I did that with yours, but I only did the base case. So if you'd sent me the other cases, I might have caught those. So I like it. I mean, it's not unusual to, have this type of issue with the case that is this complex. Do you think your conclusions would change if you made those corrections?
I think for what it was, what we saw based on everything else, I think it would make the hybrid a little bit closer, a little bit more advantageous, but I don't think it would really change our general consensus where.
And you've got a pretty expensive EV there. So I do think EV that's that much more expensive, even with that great tax credit, I agree. It's going to be tough to make that work. That's why I say it's really sensitive to which car you pick, because there might be some EVs that aren't quite that much more expensive.
We tried to go with a pretty decent gap between, because we thought that if we did the miles that we did along with a pretty close hybrid and electric and everything else, basically every time the EV would be better. And so we wanted it to be a little bit more vague and actually be an analysis that we didn't know right off the top of our head.
Yeah, that's why this spreadsheet could be really powerful if you could somehow make it so that it can handle almost any scenario, whatever you plug in. I mean, you could get pretty complex because electricity is a lot cheaper in San Antonio than in Austin. So even, gas prices are cheaper in San Antonio. So, you start talking about a lookup table and people can type in their zip code, they can type in their car, they can type in all kinds of stuff. And you could have that'd be too much for this class, right? But you could do something pretty, if you're doing this for the job, think Rebecca, you're doing this 50 hours a week building this spreadsheet, you could do something pretty spectacular with this type of case. And that's where I get really excited about this type of analysis. You really can, if you have more time and you're doing this full time, you could build something pretty impressive here. What you have is already very impressive because you've set up all the different scenarios. Okay, let me look. You talked about this for a commuter. I don't know if it matters too much. If it's, I guess the key is if they can drive fewer miles for the EV, that's really key for the EV. If you can convert that EV to 100%, That's a big deal. The EV, the hybrid, the EV, your biggest issue with the EV is you picked an expensive car and the refueling is a big issue on major trips. So it almost sounds like if you have a family with 2 cars, use the EV for your commute to work and use the gas car for your long trips, maybe. I think that's going to change, don't you, over time, that docking stations are going to become much more common. I mean, Tesla obviously has an incentive to get those things out there.
Like also maybe because they have portable car chargers that are pretty easy that you can basically just
really?
plug your jumpers into and you can just jump your vehicle right there without the need for another vehicle. If they can make those portable chargers a lot less expensive for the EV, that'll definitely help free up quite a bit. Because I mean, if I could have 2 or 3 charges in my car at any given time for like $100, $200, then that completely closes the gap of one of the intangibles that we have that is a huge deciding factor for a lot of people.
How many miles does that pick you up?
Typically, from what we saw, it was supposed to act like a full charge.
Wow. How long does it take? Is it something you do overnight where you're at the hotel or something?
It kind of seemed like from the minimal research that we did on that specifically, that it was supposed to be like if you had fast charging capabilities, it would act like a fast charger. So like 8 to 10 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Which is probably why they're $2-3 grand.
Yeah. So this is something that your analysis 4 years from now is probably going to be radically different.
Our intangibles are definitely going to be quite a bit different as people start investing more into the infrastructure needed for electronic vehicles specifically.
Yeah, that's another CBA that a team did last year, which I found the test, if I had a restaurant and I own my parking lot, I think I would put a Tesla charging station in the, it's just real estate sitting there and it doesn't take that much space and it really does make quite a bit of money.
There's actually a Kohl's out in Universal City that put 2 or 3 chargers into their parking lot.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You get customers going in and shopping while they're charging their car or a restaurant or whatever. All right, I love this case. You got some time, you want to clean up, I'll grade your Excel based on the last one you send me. So you want to do one last double check. You could even reword. You did a great job on your final recommendation if you want to reword some of that as well. So I don't need it until, Saturday or Sunday. So you got some time, just email me your final one and that's the one I'll make my official final pick. The Excel is like 40% of the grade. So if you want to edit it and fix it a little bit, that's the one I'll use, whatever the final one you send me is. All right, good. Yeah, I like this case, not just because I have a hybrid, but this is changing technology and CBAs is a big part of whether or not this is going to work or not. It's not going to work if it costs people more money. So it's, the technology is going to change and the math is going to change. So, all right. Nima, did you have any questions?
No, sir, I didn't. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.